We're going to talk about this today in JavaScript. Let me move this up a smidge. I'm going to break this. We're not going to move it at all. I'm going to break it. OK. Let me make that a little more full screen. So I'm the code boss. Aaron Krauss is my full name. That's my Twitter handle. I work at a company called Clevyr. You've probably seen our logo around a lot. We do consulting. We have some internal products, too. We work with a lot of companies and individuals nearby. We've also started a company called Clevyr Labs. You've probably heard me rant about this. We specialize in virtual reality at Clevyr Labs. VR games, HTC Vive, a couple different other things. If you have never played with virtual reality, feel free to stop by our office on Classen 9th. We'd love to show you. It's super awesome. You also may know me as the shirt thrower. I throw out shirts at a lot of my talks. And I've got one, because this is a lightning talk. It's an XL. And I got one question that I'm about to ask. But before I do that, let me segue back and talk about what this talk is going to actually focus on. If you've used JavaScript, you've probably used this before, this being the keyword that refers to your context. There's a couple different ways that this can get set. This will be a just very condensed talk. I love digging into these kind of simple concepts, but digging into how they really work. So we're going to talk about how you can actually set this for your function or whatever. So there's 4 ways you can actually set this. You can change the context of this. Can someone give me 2 of those ways? And if you can, then you get a shirt. We'll go with Jesse. Well, let's see. I know Jesse knows it. What was it? Call and apply. Yep, that's perfect. Jesse, I'm sure you'll get a shirt in the future. Well, we're about to. So the 4. So call and apply are kind of combined into this one thing called soft binding. We start off with the default way. That's just the way that this is set, the normal way. You have soft binding, you have hard binding, and then you have the new keyword. And we're going to dig into what these all mean through code. OK, let me zoom in here. Let's go a little bit more. OK, can we all see that pretty well? OK, if anyone can't, feel free to shout out. I'll zoom in. OK, so I've got 5 examples here. Count them, 5. We're going to talk about, this is the default way that this is set. By default, this is set to whatever context you're executing in, which right here, we've got a function called bar. We're going to print out this, and we're invoking bar right here. So what is, and it's just going to print out this. What is this here? That sounds pretty philosophical, doesn't it? Well, this is going to just print out whatever your global scope is, which if you're in a browser, that's going to be window. If you're running it server side like we are here, it's going to be just the global environment. I don't think there's any surprises there. So let's dig into something bigger. But this, we didn't have to do anything special to set this. It just by default is the context we're executing in. So let's take that a little bit step further. We've still got our function bar that's printing out. Instead of printing out this, though, we're going to print out this.foobar. We've got an object here, foo. This object has a property called foobar, and it's got a function, or another property called bar, which just we'll call the function bar. And we've got 2 different cases right here. We're going to just invoke bar on the global object just by calling the function, and we're going to call foo.bar, which we'll call the same function, but from a different context. So what's going to happen here? Again, I think you can probably guess it pretty well. The first one, undefined, we're going to call bar. It's going to call this.foobar. Well, foobar doesn't exist on the global this, so it's undefined. But on this line right here, foo.bar, that's going to print out foobar because the bar function is invoked with the context of foo. So when we're inside of this function here, this is referring to foo, which again, this is not object-oriented programming, but or at least class-based object-oriented programming, but if you've used anything like Java or something like that, this probably makes complete sense. This is the object that's calling it, so that's going to be what the context is set to. So it's calling this foobar property right here. Again, nothing crazy going on here. Now we're going to get into the other ways, which there's a priority going on here, and that's what we're going to talk about too. The default way you set this is the lowest priority way that this gets set. The next way, if you want to override this, is what's called soft binding, which is kind of like Adam talked about, using call and apply. So let's dig into what that actually looks like. Oh, I think boy, everything looks terrible when it's zoomed in. Okay, there we go. No, yeah, that's right. That's the right one. Okay, it's the exact same script, except we got one line down at the bottom. We've got bar.call. What call will do, bar is our function. Normally, if we call bar, it's going to execute, it's going to try to print out this.foobar, which doesn't exist. It's going to be undefined. But when we call the call function on bar, and the first argument we pass into call is going to be what we actually want to change the this context to. And this is how apply works too. I'm going to show that in a minute. So what we're doing here is we're invoking the bar function, which is invoked at the global context, but we're saying, hey, we want to change this to be foo, the foo object. So kind of as you might expect, we're going to print out the first two are just the bar and the foo.bar above. But the last one is the one that we really care about. So we're soft binding the foo object in the function bar, so we're actually sending in a new context. This is how we're overriding this context. Again, this works just the same way if we wanted to call apply. Those both will print out foobar. There is a difference between call and apply. If the bar function had some arguments you wanted to pass in, call, you would pass it in as such, just as, however many arguments there are, whereas apply accepts an array of arguments. And this is beneficial. This has nothing to do with this, but this is just beneficial if you don't know how many arguments your function you're invoking is going to take. Anyway, just a the more you know type thing. So apply and call, soft binding. That's the second way you can set this, and the second lowest, or the one step above priority in setting this. The next way is probably going to be a way that we probably used before, and maybe you think it's magic, maybe you don't, but we're going to dig into what it actually means. And this is called hard binding, that third way right there. Hard binding, right here, I've kind of switched things around a little bit, but all the code is still the same. We've got an object called foo. I removed the bar reference just to avert confusion. Right now, it's just an object that has the foobar property. We've got a function here. I switched this from a function declaration, which is where you just have function bar this, to a function expression, where you set the variable to the function. Because you can't hard bind a function declaration. You can only hard bind a function expression like this. Anyway, when I go here, when I call bar like this, we're invoking it on the global context, which would be the window object or the global environment, whatever it is. And we're going to call this .foobar, which doesn't exist. But because we're binding, and we're actually, this is something you don't normally see. We're calling .bind on the function itself. It looks a little strange. But we're actually binding the foo object to this inside of the bar function. So whenever we invoke this function, we kind of get, again, kind of what you probably expected from assuming that we're binding this. We get that we're printing out foobar instead of the global object. If I were just to call like that, we're going to get undefined. Now, just to prove that this is a higher priority than soft binding, what happens if we call bar.call this? Again, this is going to be confusing, but the this here refers to the global context, which does not have the foobar property. So if soft binding were to work, then that would print out undefined. But it's not going to work. And again, if we were to, just to prove again, if we do this, they'll both be undefined. So hard binding supersedes the default binding of this and soft binding. The final way you can set this, in the ultimate way, you cannot change how this is set in this manner, is the new keyword. So let's take an example here. We've got a function bar. I know people like to call these constructor functions. I just want to call them functions because that's even if you're using the new keyword, it's still just a function. We're printing out this.foobar, nothing new. We've still got our object foo, and we're saying bar equals new bar, and we're going to print out this.foobar. And by default, this is not going to exist. And we're not trying to change bar at all. Nothing is setting foobar. We're not passing foo to this bar function call. So it's going to be undefined. But what happens if I try to do, if I just try to call, bar dot this? Oops, that's the wrong function call. what if we try to soft bind foo to just to invoke that function? This would actually work, but what happens if we throw in? Actually, we can't soft bind it. If we were to try to, we have to use a new keyword. If we were to try to soft bind this, I think we get an error. So we're not going to soft bind it. But what if I make this if I actually make this a hard bound function? But to do that, we're going to switch this to a function declaration. Let's move that up here just so we avert any issues. OK, so we're going to bind foo to this function. And we're going to erase that. So we're hard binding the foo object to this function, and then we're going to call new on it. Again, hard binding is the next best thing we can do, but it still is going to print out undefined, because what new does is it will actually create a new object, an empty object, and pass that into whatever function you're invoking here, bar. And you can't do anything about that. You cannot override this in this. New actually does a couple other neat things too, one of which is it'll return the this object. Notice how we don't ever return anything here, but we're setting something equal to it. There's a few other things that new can do, but this is the order of this setting in JavaScript. You have the default setting. You can soft bind on top of that. That'll override that. Hard binding supersedes that. And then the new keyword is the ultimate way to set the this keyword. So one of those things that you may or may not use, but I think it'll help you out. Just kind of understand more about how JavaScript works as a language. And I didn't have this as a reference, but a lot of the stuff I learned from Kyle Simpson's book, You Don't Know JS. He's got some video series too on Pluralsight. Super awesome resources. Go check that out. And again, I'm the code boss, and that's my website where I blog. So, any questions? All right, let's raise the roof one more time.